Foundations of the crown, before the monarchy. The ancient tribes of Britain. Before the crown, before castles, and before the stories of queens and kings that echo through the corridors of time, there were quiet forests, mist-covered hills, and the gentle rhythm of rivers winding their way across the land. Britain, in its earliest days, was a place untouched by the grandeur of monarchy, a wild and ancient place, wrapped in silence, and ruled not by gold or law, but by the rhythm of the earth and sky. Long before the idea of England or Scotland existed, the island we now call Britain was home to a mosaic of tribes. These early people, often called the Britons, or more precisely, the Celtic tribes, lived in scattered settlements, bound not by crowns or thrones, but by kinship, tradition, and sacred memory. Their world was one of stone and wood, wind and fire. No palaces stood on the hills then, only roundhouses with thatched roofs, gently steaming in the rain, nestled close to one another in the shadow of thick woods and rolling moorlands. The tribes had names, whispered to us by Roman scribes long after the time had passed. The Brigantes, who held sway in the north, where modern-day Yorkshire now lies. The Iceni, fierce and proud, who would later be led by the famous warrior Queen Boudica. The Trinovantes, near what would become London. And the Catuvellauni, powerful and ambitious, pressing ever outward with their influence. Each tribe had its own customs, its own stories, and its own deep reverence for nature. The forest was not just a place of shelter or hunting, but a living being, sacred and mysterious. Trees were watched for omens. Stones were placed in circles to mark time, or perhaps to speak to the stars. The Druids, priests and wise men of these ancient peoples, were keepers of knowledge and ritual. Though much about them is lost in the fog of time, we know they held power, and that they moved between tribes like shadows, conducting ceremonies, offering wisdom, and maintaining the balance between the earthly and the divine. Their leadership was not what we would now call monarchy. There were chieftains, sometimes male, sometimes female, chosen perhaps by birth, perhaps by strength or wisdom. But there were no crowns, no royal regalia. The authority came not from divine right or parchment, but from presence, lineage, and the approval of one's people. And yet, even then, we begin to see the early shimmer of something we might call kingship, a figure to guide, to protect, to lead in times of peace and war. The seeds of monarchy were there, small and unshaped, buried beneath the soil of clan loyalty and tribal law. Life was simple, but not easy. These people farmed the land using wooden tools, raised sheep and cattle, and stored grain in great earthen pits. They wore woolen cloaks and adorned themselves with bronze and later iron, shaping torques, neck rings, and brooches, symbols of status and artistry. Trade routes stretched across the sea to Gaul, and beyond. Amber, salt, tin, and furs moved slowly from hand to hand, tribe to tribe, a quiet network of exchange that tied these early Britons to the wider world, long before Rome ever dreamed of Britannia. Though they were not united, there were bonds between the tribes, alliances, marriages, rivalries, and occasional wars. These conflicts were often small and local. Raids over territory or livestock, tensions over sacred sites. But still, the idea of a united ruler, someone who could bring the scattered peoples together under one rule, remained far away, like the sound of a drumbeat too distant to hear clearly. The island itself was not called Britain then. That name would come later. To its people, it was simply home, a place of hills and marshes, cliffs and rivers, where the sky opened wide above, and the earth whispered stories from beneath. Seasons came and went. The rains fell softly on the roundhouses. Fires crackled in the hearths. Children learned from elders, sitting quietly as stories were passed down in low, careful voices. Songs were sung to the wind. Animals were offered in sacred rites. And life moved slowly forward, much as it always had. The people of this ancient Britain were resilient and deeply attuned to the land. They watched the skies for signs, and the movements of birds and stars told them when to sow and when to harvest. There were festivals, times of joy and dancing, of music and fire. There were moments of sorrow too, marked with quiet ceremony and the planting of memories beneath the earth. This was a world before kings, before cathedrals, before the idea of a nation. But even in its simplicity, there was something regal in the way they lived, with honor, with connection to the land, and with stories that reached back further than anyone could remember. So as we begin our long and gentle journey through the history of the British monarchy, we start not with the crowning of a king, but with the slow heartbeat of a land that would one day call them forth. A land where the crown was still just a dream, drifting like morning mist across the moors, waiting to take shape. Roman occupation and governance. The quiet lives of the ancient tribes, nestled among the hills and forests of early Britain, would one day be stirred by the slow and deliberate approach of distant power. Across the narrow sea, in a land of marble and empire, Rome had been watching. To the Romans, this misty island at the edge of the world was a land of mystery and potential. Wild, rich with resources, and waiting to be brought into the fold of. It was in 55 BCE, under the command of Julius Caesar, that the first Roman expedition arrived on Britain's shores. His arrival, though brief and more symbolic than strategic, marked the beginning of centuries of transformation. Caesar left without conquering the island, but he planted a seed of ambition that would grow stronger in time. It wasn't until nearly a century later, in 43 CE, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, that the Roman Empire returned with force and purpose. This time, they did not merely land and leave, they came to stay. With legions of disciplined soldiers, fortified camps, and a strategy refined by decades of conquest, the Romans moved inward from the southern shores, pressing into the heartland of the island. The native tribes resisted bravely. Among them was the formidable Queen Boudica, leader of the Iceni tribe. Her revolt in 60 CE stands as a symbol of resistance, her chariots, warriors, and fury rising against the invading force after her people were wronged. She burned Roman towns, including London, and brought terror to the occupiers. But in time, even this powerful rebellion was quelled. The Roman grip tightened, and a new way of life began to take hold. The Romans did not merely conquer land, they reshaped it. Under their rule, Britain began to change. Roads were carved through the countryside, straight and enduring, many of which still influence routes today. Towns were founded or expanded. Londinium, Eboracum, and Camulodunum grew as centers of administration, trade, and military presence. Governance under the Romans was not monarchy, but it introduced something Britain had not known before: centralized, imperial control. A governor, appointed from Rome, ruled in the emperor's name. He maintained law and order, collected taxes, and oversaw the defense of the province. While local tribal leaders still held sway in smaller areas, often as clients or allies of Rome, the real power flowed from the emperor, far away in the Eternal City. Temples and baths rose where sacred groves once stood. Markets and forums took the place of tribal gathering spots. Latin became the language of law, inscription, and commerce. Slowly, the people of Britain began to blend the old with the new, adopting Roman dress, customs, architecture, and even gods. Yet beneath the surface, the ancient beliefs and identities endured, quietly folded into this new imperial reality. The idea of kingship still slumbered, but Roman governance offered something new to Britain: the concept of hierarchy, law, and imperial authority as a unifying force. Power came from above, from the emperor, whose image was carved into coins and whose decrees were enforced by soldiers. This model, though foreign to the tribal traditions of old, would later echo in the ideas of monarchy that emerged after Rome's departure. Roman Britain was not always peaceful. In the north, resistance continued. To mark the boundary between the empire and the unconquered tribes, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a massive wall in 122 CE, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching across the narrow neck of the island, it was a symbol of division and defense. To the south of it lay Roman order. To the north, freedom or rebellion, depending on one's view. Though the wall was a boundary, it also became a place of contact, of trade, exchange, and diplomacy. The garrisons stationed along its length were diverse. Soldiers from across the empire, from as far as Africa and the Middle East, all watching the moors and forests for movement, smoke, or signs of unrest. Roman Britain lasted for nearly 4 centuries. Over that time, generations were born into a world where Rome was all they had ever known. Villas dotted the countryside, built with heated floors and intricate mosaics. Amphitheaters echoed with voices and spectacle. Christianity, once outlawed, began to spread quietly across the land, offering a new vision of divine order and heavenly kingship. Yet, even the might of Rome was not eternal. By the early 5th century, the empire was weakening. Pressures on its borders, economic strain, and political upheaval in the heart of Rome left distant provinces like Britain vulnerable. The legions were slowly withdrawn. Forts fell silent. Governors lost touch with their imperial masters. And at last, in 410 CE, Rome officially abandoned Britain, leaving the island to its own devices. What remained was a strange and delicate echo, a land once tribal, then imperial, now left to remember both. The roads and towns remained, though many would fall into disrepair. The Roman gods faded, but their temples lingered. The laws, the structures, the very idea of a distant, overarching authority, they did not vanish entirely. In the silence that followed Rome's retreat, a new kind of leadership began to emerge. Tribal chiefs rose once again, but now their rule carried traces of Roman structure and ambition. The seeds of monarchy, scattered in the soil by both tribal memory and imperial example, began, ever so slowly, to take root. It would be some time before Britain would see kings crowned in stone cathedrals or queens riding in golden coaches. But the pattern was beginning to form. From the shadow of the eagle's wings, a crown would someday rise. For now, the land exhaled. The roads grew quiet. The forts crumbled. And the people turned inward, to the old stories and the changing skies, waiting for the next chapter in their long and winding tale. Foundations of the crown, before the monarchy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As the mighty empire of Rome faded into memory, Britain once again became a land of transition, a place where the past echoed through crumbling walls, and the future remained cloaked in morning mist. The Roman legions were gone. The governors no longer ruled, and the people of the land found themselves adrift in a quiet and uncertain dawn. It was during this time of change that new peoples arrived, not in a single wave, but slowly, steadily, like the rising tide. From across the North Sea, from the shores of what are now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, came the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Seafarers and settlers, they did not come as conquerors in shining armor, but as migrants seeking new homes, though some came with sword in hand. These newcomers did not think of themselves as a unified force. Each group had its own customs, leaders, and dialects. But together, over time, they reshaped the identity of the land. The language they spoke, an early form of Old English, began to replace Latin and the native Brittonic tongues. The culture they brought, simple and rooted in kinship and warrior codes, spread across the countryside, carving out a new order in a land that had once been Roman. As Roman towns crumbled, the new settlers built their villages on open land, wooden halls surrounded by fields and forest. The great stone structures of the past gave way to timber and thatch. Yet, within these simple communities, the seeds of future kingdoms were beginning to grow, remembered not only for their battles but for their patronage of learning and faith. The kings of early Wales walked between worlds, protectors of their people and guardians of tradition. In Ireland, the idea of kingship took on its own unique form. Dozens of small kingdoms, or tuata, were ruled by local kings, known as Ri. Over these were overkings, and above them still, the figure of the High King, or Ord Ri, who claimed symbolic overlordship of the entire island. At Tara, a sacred site in the Boyne Valley, kings were inaugurated in ancient rituals that blended power, land, and the blessings of the gods. Though Ireland is not part of Britain, its traditions would later influence the development of kingship in parts of Scotland and Wales. The Gaelic concept of leadership, intertwined with myth and ancestry, would echo for centuries. Back in Britain, the Roman occupation had largely disrupted these native structures, but not entirely replaced them. Tribal leaders who cooperated with Rome were often allowed to rule their people as client kings. One such figure was Cogidubnus, a king of the Regnances, who adopted Roman customs and governance while maintaining his authority under imperial patronage. Another was Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, whose tragic story is forever tied to that of his wife, Boudica. Upon his death, his will sought to divide his kingdom between his daughters and the Roman emperor. But Rome refused to honor the arrangement, leading to Boudica's famous uprising, a fiery stand for dignity, sovereignty, and remembrance. After the Romans withdrew, tribal leadership reasserted itself. In the early Anglo-Saxon period, kings began to emerge once more, but now shaped by both native tradition and Roman influence. The earliest kings of these peoples were still tribal in character, bound to warrior bands and familial loyalty. Their power lay in their ability to lead, to defend, and to inspire. They wore no crowns, but they bore rings, gifts exchanged between lord and thane to mark allegiance and reward. Their halls were filled with the warmth of feasts, the clatter of shields, and the songs of Scops, Anglo-Saxon poets who carried history in verse. One such figure, Cerdic of Wessex, is remembered as the founder of a line that would eventually unite England. Whether entirely historical or partly legendary, Cerdic's story reflects a time when kingship was emerging from the mists of myth into something more lasting. The kings of this era ruled not through bureaucracy, but through bonds. A king's retinue, or comitatus, formed the backbone of his power, loyal warriors who pledged their lives to him in return for land, protection, and status. In battle, they fought by his side. In peace, they served as advisors and enforcers of his will. The spiritual dimension of kingship also remained strong. Many tribal kings were seen as sacral figures, chosen by the gods or blessed by divine favor. Rituals, some lost to time, accompanied their rise to power. In some cultures, the health of the land was thought to be tied to the virtue of the king. A just ruler brought prosperity. A flawed one invited famine and unrest. The image of the king as the heart of the people, the first among equals, the guardian of tradition, the keeper of stories, was a common thread across the British Isles. This early vision of monarchy was not grand or polished. It was raw, living, and close to the earth. It grew from hearths and forests, from sacred springs and stone circles, from memory and myth. And yet, it laid the foundation for everything that would follow. The crown we know today, gleaming with jewels, resting on velvet cushions, owes its origins to these ancient kings and chieftains. Their rule was not about spectacle, but survival. Not about grandeur, but meaning. They ruled with their people, not above them. And in their quiet halls, among the flicker of torches and the hum of ancient songs, the soul of British kingship began to take shape. Celtic influence and oral traditions. Before the crown was ever forged in gold, before parchment bore royal decrees, and before the sound of coronation bells filled the air, there were voices. Quiet, rhythmic, enduring voices, passing stories from lip to ear, generation to generation, around firelit hearths beneath the stars. In the ancient British Isles, the Celts, a people as elusive as the mists that curled around their stone circles, wove the first great stories of the land. And while their rulers were warriors and chieftains, their true power lay in something deeper, the oral tradition. A vast and living memory, carried not in books, but in hearts. The Celts, unlike the Romans or Greeks, left behind very little in the way of written history. Instead, they preserved their past through songs, poems, and spoken law. Their bards, druids, and fili were not mere entertainers. They were historians, philosophers, and priests of memory. These men, and sometimes women, were trained from youth to remember. Not just lines or verses, but entire histories, laws, genealogies, and sacred teachings. For a people without books, the spoken word was sacred, and forgetting was a kind of death. In Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and even parts of Cornwall and Brittany, the bardic tradition endured. It whispered of gods and heroes, of ancient battles and divine kings. These stories often blurred the lines between history and myth, but that was never the point. Truth, for the Celts, was not just about facts. It was about feeling, about identity, about connection to place and blood. Among the Welsh, the figure of the cypherwit, a storyteller and oral historian, played a central role in keeping ancestral memory alive. He would recite the genealogies of kings, chant the sagas of saints, and recount the heroic deeds of ancestors long past. In Ireland, the Fili held high rank in society, often above nobles. They knew hundreds of tales by heart, each with meaning, each echoing the values of courage, loyalty, and honor. Their words could immortalize a king, or bring shame upon him. These storytellers were also the guardians of Celtic cosmology, a vision of the world in which nature, time, and spirit were intertwined. The land itself had a voice. Rivers remembered. Hills held memory. Trees whispered the names of the dead. In such a worldview, kingship was not just political, it was spiritual. A true king ruled in harmony with the land and its stories. If he was unjust or impure, the land would suffer, crops would fail, herds would dwindle, and storms would rise. This belief gave rise to one of the most beautiful and haunting aspects of early kingship, the sovereignty goddess. In many Celtic traditions, the land itself was personified as a woman, a divine figure who offered her hand in marriage to the worthy king. Only by uniting with her, symbolically or ritually, could a man become the rightful ruler. Such myths reflected the deep interconnection between people, power, and place. The king was not above the land, he was wedded to it. The famous Irish tale of Niall of the Nine Hostages tells of a young prince who encounters an old crone guarding a well. She demands a kiss in exchange for water. Disgusted, his brothers refuse. But Niall, recognizing something sacred, embraces her. She transforms into a beautiful goddess and grants him kingship over Ireland. This was no mere fairy tale. It was a profound allegory for the sacred duties of rule. In Scotland, the echoes of Celtic kingship lived on in the Dalriadic kings who arrived from Ireland, bringing with them Gaelic culture and oral heritage. They would later help shape the Kingdom of Alba, the precursor to the medieval Scottish crown. Even in post-Roman Britain, long after Latin writing had taken root, the oral traditions remained alive. The legends of King Arthur, though heavily mythologized, likely sprang from this early Celtic imagination. Arthur may or may not have existed, but the tales told of him speak deeply of what the people longed for in a ruler: bravery, justice, and a sense of timeless nobility. These stories were not static. They evolved with each telling, shaped by the teller, the audience, and the needs of the time. A king who lived 200 years ago might be reborn in song as a dragon slayer, a peacebringer, or a man blessed by fairies. In this way, the line between history and poetry vanished, and what remained was something larger: cultural memory. Though the Christian Church would later encourage written records and Latin literacy, it did not entirely erase the Celtic oral spirit. In fact, early Christian monks in Ireland and Wales preserved many of these tales by writing them down, giving us works such as the Mabinogion and the Tyne Bo Quailnge. Through these manuscripts, we catch glimpses of the older, pre-Christian world still breathing through the pages. These stories, sung in darkened halls, murmured beside fires, or chanted on windswept hills, carried more than entertainment. They taught virtues. They recorded law. They explained the sacred order of the world. And in doing so, they shaped the early kings of Britain and their people. Even centuries later, when monarchs would be crowned in grand cathedrals and rule vast empires, something of this old tradition remained. The idea of the king as a living symbol, as a bridge between the past and the present, as a figure wrapped not only in authority but in story, this was the inheritance of the Celtic past. To understand the British monarchy is to understand that it was not built on laws and conquests alone. It was also built on song, memory, and myth. Long before a crown was ever made of gold, it was woven in words. And so, in the soft cadence of old tales, the roots of kingship grew, deep into the soil, through the stones, and into the hearts of a people who remembered, who dreamed, and who believed that the land itself could speak. The Roman withdrawal and its aftermath. The Roman Empire, in its mighty and meticulous way, had wrapped much of Britain in its embrace. For nearly 400 years, Roman roads cut across the wild terrain, Roman law tempered tribal custom, and Roman governors oversaw cities of stone and tile, far removed from the wooden hillforts of earlier days. But, like all things bound to time, Rome's reach began to falter. By the early 5th century, the empire was stretched thin. Troubles on the continent, barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic strain drew Roman legions away from the remote western provinces. Britain, once a prized corner of imperial order, was left increasingly to fend for itself. The official Roman withdrawal, often dated around 410 AD, was not marked by a grand departure or a solemn decree. It was quieter, more gradual. A fading presence, like the tide pulling gently back from the shore. For the people of Britain, the change was profound. In the Roman cities, places like Londinium, London, Eboracum, York, and Verulamium, St. Albans, buildings began to fall into disrepair. Without the steady hand of imperial maintenance, mosaics crumbled, aqueducts cracked, and forums fell silent. Some towns became ghostly, half-inhabited ruins. Others were slowly reclaimed by grass, ivy, and time. The soldiers, who once patrolled Hadrian's Wall and the southern roads, were now gone. In their place rose the uncertainty of raiders, from the Picts in the north, the Scots from across the Irish Sea, and increasingly, the mysterious Saxons who came from across the eastern waters. Without Rome, the people turned inward. The local aristocracy, often men of mixed Roman and native heritage, sought to protect their own. These landholders, once part of Rome's provincial elite, began to act more independently. Some styled themselves as kings, others as dukes or warlords. Their authority was often based on their control of fortified estates, their loyalty from armed retainers. In this shifting landscape, the concept of kingship began to reform. It was not the same as tribal chieftainship, nor was it Roman bureaucracy. It was something new, emerging from necessity. A man who could defend his lands, feed his followers, and negotiate peace or war with neighboring leaders became, in essence, a king. One of the most famous figures of this post-Roman world is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British leader said to have organized resistance against the Saxons. Though we know little of him with certainty, his name would echo in later legends, especially those of King Arthur. This period, often called the sub-Roman or post-Roman Britain, is veiled in shadow. Historians refer to it as a dark age not because it was without meaning, but because the records are dim. But in the stillness of those centuries, great changes were taking root. The old Roman towns, though crumbling, left their mark. The language of Latin lingered, especially in the church. Roman Christianity, introduced in the later days of empire, remained a flickering flame in Britain's spiritual life. Bishops continued to serve, monks continued to pray, and in hidden monasteries and isolated cells, sacred knowledge was quietly preserved. And yet, alongside the legacy of Rome, new voices began to rise. The Anglo-Saxons, invited at first as mercenaries to help defend the eastern coasts, soon became settlers. They came from regions we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, tribes like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. At first, they worked with the native Britons. But over time, they carved out territories of their own. The Saxons established kingdoms, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, named for their tribes and lands. The Angles settled in places that would become Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. These newcomers brought their own customs, gods, and languages. The old Latin and Brythonic tongues gave way, in many places, to the early forms of Old English. But the transition was not simply conquest. It was also mingling of peoples, beliefs, and ways of life. In some areas, the Romano-British retreated to the west, into Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north, preserving their Celtic language and traditions. In other places, they remained, living under new rulers, slowly adapting to new norms. It is in this moment, in this space between empires and nations, that the seed of the British monarchy began to take root. The kings of this time were often military leaders, but also figures of spiritual significance. In the absence of Roman law, without Rome, the people turned inward. The local aristocracy, often men of mixed Roman and native heritage, sought to protect their own. These landholders, once part of Rome's provincial elite, began to act more independently. Some styled themselves as kings, others as dukes or warlords. Their authority was often based on their control of fortified estates, their loyalty from armed retainers. In this shifting landscape, the concept of kingship began to reform. It was not the same as tribal chieftainship, nor was it Roman bureaucracy. It was something new, emerging from necessity. A man who could defend his lands, feed his followers, and negotiate peace or war with neighboring leaders became, in essence, a king. One of the most famous figures of this post-Roman world is Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British leader said to have organized resistance against the Saxons. Though we know little of him with certainty, his name would echo in later legends, especially those of King Arthur. This period, often called the sub-Roman or post-Roman Britain, is veiled in shadow. Historians refer to it as a dark age not because it was without meaning, but because the records are dim. But in the stillness of those centuries, great changes were taking root. The old Roman towns, though crumbling, left their mark. The language of Latin lingered, especially in the church. Roman Christianity, introduced in the later days of empire, remained a flickering flame in Britain's spiritual life. Bishops continued to serve, monks continued to pray, and in hidden monasteries and isolated cells, sacred knowledge was quietly preserved. And yet, alongside the legacy of Rome, new voices began to rise. The Anglo-Saxons, invited at first as mercenaries to help defend the eastern coasts, soon became settlers. They came from regions we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, tribes like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. At first, they worked with the native Britons. But over time, they carved out territories of their own. The Saxons established kingdoms, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, named for their tribes and lands. The Angles settled in places that would become Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. These newcomers brought their own customs, gods, and languages. The old Latin and Brythonic tongues gave way, in many places, to the early forms of Old English. But the transition was not simply conquest. It was also mingling of peoples, beliefs, and ways of life. In some areas, the Romano-British retreated to the west, into Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north, preserving their Celtic language and traditions. In other places, they remained, living under new rulers, slowly adapting to new norms. It is in this moment, in this space between empires and nations, that the seed of the British monarchy began to take root. The kings of this time were often military leaders, but also figures of spiritual significance. In the absence of Roman law, they provided justice. In the absence of Roman protection, they offered defense. They ruled not from golden thrones, but from timber halls on hilltops. Their kingdoms were small, sometimes no larger than a modern county, but to their people, they were everything. These early kings were advised by witan, councils of elders and warriors, who helped shape decisions and governance. It was a fragile system, but it carried echoes of both tribal democracy and Roman formality. As decades passed, these kingdoms began to consolidate. Alliances were formed, wars were fought, dynasties emerged. By the end of the 6th century, England was a land of 7 major kingdoms, a time later known as the Heptarchy. From among these, future monarchs would rise. And yet, the memory of Rome lingered. The roads they built still guided armies and pilgrims. The ruins of their towns served as silent reminders of order and civilization. And their vision of law, record, and imperial dignity would eventually influence the shape of monarchy yet to come. This period was one of transition, a bridge between the classical world and the medieval, between emperors and kings, between the Roman eagle and the English lion. In the stillness after empire, as old temples turned to churches and Latin prayers echoed over Celtic hills, a new story was beginning. A story of kings and queens, of lineage and legend. A story that would lead, centuries later, to the rise of the British monarchy. It all began here, in the quiet after Rome. Anglo-Saxon kings and the Heptarchy. In the hush of early morning, as the mists curled around the green hills of ancient England, a new kind of king was stirring to life. He was not a Roman governor, nor a Celtic chieftain, nor a forgotten echo of myth, but something new, something quietly forming in the woodlands, valleys, and fields of the Anglo-Saxon world. From the 5th to the 9th century, England was not yet a single land, but rather a patchwork, a quilt of small kingdoms, each ruled by its own Anglo-Saxon king. This period is known as the Heptarchy, a Greek word meaning 7 rulers, and it refers to the 7 most prominent kingdoms that came to dominate early medieval England. These kingdoms were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Each had its own customs, dialects, and warrior aristocracy. Some looked toward the old Roman ways. Others leaned into the Germanic traditions brought across the sea. But they were all bound together by a new form of leadership, kingship born of strength, ancestry, and sacred duty. This blending of crown and cross gave rise to the concept of sacred kingship. Ceremonies of coronation were not just political rituals. They were holy sacraments. A king knelt before the altar. He was sprinkled with holy water, anointed on the head, chest, and hands. He received a sword to defend the faith, a ring to symbolize fidelity, and a crown to mark his place beneath heaven. This practice had its origins in both Roman and biblical tradition. The anointing of kings echoed the consecration of prophets and priests in the Old Testament. It symbolized that the monarch was not only the ruler of a people, but also the servant of God. As Christianity spread across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it also brought monasteries, cathedrals, and schools. Places like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Canterbury became centers of learning. Here, monks copied texts, chronicled history, and preserved the memory of kings in careful Latin script. Monarchs began to endow churches, support abbeys, and found religious houses. They donated land and gold to the church, not only to gain favor in life, but to secure prayers for their souls in death. The relationship between king and churchman grew close. Bishops sat on royal councils. Archbishops crowned rulers. Saints were sometimes royal, and royals sometimes saints. One such example is King Oswald of Northumbria, who was remembered not only for his military victories but for his devout Christian faith. He invited monks from Iona to evangelize his kingdom, and after his death in battle, his body was venerated as a holy relic. His head and limbs were buried in separate churches, and miracles were said to occur at his tomb. Another figure, King Edmund of East Anglia, was killed by Danish invaders for refusing to renounce his faith. He was later canonized as Saint Edmund, and a great abbey grew around his shrine in Bury Street, Edmonds. Through such examples, the image of a Christian king became idealized, brave, just, humble, and pious. A king was expected to uphold not only laws and lands, but the faith of his people. His legitimacy came not just from bloodline or conquest, but from his perceived holiness. As the 8th and 9th centuries unfolded, the church itself grew more powerful. It preserved learning, administered justice, and maintained records. A literate clergy often served as royal scribes and diplomats. Christian values shaped law codes, especially those concerning marriage, inheritance, and moral behavior. Kings, in turn, used the church to strengthen their rule. By aligning themselves with bishops and abbots, they extended their influence over both sacred and secular spheres. Royal charters granted lands to monasteries. Councils of nobles and clerics deliberated laws together. The idea that king and bishop ruled side by side became a cornerstone of English governance. Even when invasions threatened, faith endured. The coming of the Vikings in the late 8th century brought destruction to many monasteries and churches. Holy books were burned, relics stolen, monks killed. But even in these dark times, Christian kingship remained resilient. In fact, the defense of the faith against pagan invaders became part of a king's sacred duty. This struggle would define the reign of Alfred the Great, who not only fought the Danes but also revived learning, protected the church, and envisioned a unified Christian kingdom. Alfred saw kingship as a divine vocation, one that demanded wisdom, patience, and devotion. Ships to patrol the southern coasts. He implemented legal reforms, drawing upon Christian principles and older Anglo-Saxon customs. Most importantly, Alfred sought to restore learning and faith. He invited scholars to his court, commissioned the translation of Latin texts into Old English, and encouraged literacy among the clergy and nobility. The flame of culture, nearly extinguished by war, flickered once more under his care. Alfred's leadership was not only military, it was moral. He envisioned a king as both protector and teacher, guardian of his people's souls as well as their homes. In this, he exemplified the evolving ideal of sacred kingship amid the harsh realities of survival. Through patience, diplomacy, and strategy, Alfred secured a peace with the Viking leader Guthrum, who eventually converted to Christianity. The Treaty of Wedmore divided the land between the English and the Danelaw, bringing a temporary calm. Yet the Viking threat did not end with Alfred's victories. It would continue through the reigns of his successors, his son Edward the Elder, his daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, and his grandson Ethelstan, who would become the first king of a truly unified England. Together, they pushed back against the Viking-held territories, reclaimed land, and brought the English kingdoms under a single crown. The resilience of these rulers lay not only in swords and shields, but in their persistence, vision, and faith. They did not surrender to despair. They adapted. They absorbed. And in some cases, they welcomed the Vikings into their world. Indeed, the Norse presence left a lasting mark. Place names, legal terms, and even aspects of governance were shaped by this encounter. English kings learned to negotiate with new kinds of rivals, and the monarchy began to develop a more sophisticated sense of diplomacy and power. In time, some Viking rulers themselves became kings of England. Knut the Great, a Danish prince, would ascend the English throne in the 11th century, not as a conqueror alone, but as a Christian king who married into the Anglo-Saxon royal family and governed with skill and grace. Thus, the Viking invasions, while devastating in many respects, also catalyzed a transformation. They forced the English kingship to evolve, to harden, and to grow wise. Through fire and trial, the crown became not just a symbol of lineage, but of leadership in crisis, of the ability to endure, adapt, and rebuild. So as we drift now from the age of raiders into the dawn of unity, let us remember. The English monarchy was not forged in peace, but in resilience. In muddy marshes and smoky halls, in desperate treaties and sacred oaths, the idea of a steadfast, sacred crown was born, not because the kings were always victorious, but because they always endured. Towards a kingdom, the rise of Wessex. In the slow-turning wheel of English history, there is a quiet but steady moment when the scattered kingdoms, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and more, begin to drift toward one name, one banner, and one crown. That moment, like a tide inching up the shore, belonged to Wessex. Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, had long existed in the southern reaches of what we now call England. Fertile lands, gentle rivers, and rolling downs formed its countryside. Unlike its neighbors in the north and east, Wessex had, by good fortune and good judgment, managed to hold the line against the worst of the Viking invasions. The rise of Wessex began, in many ways, with Alfred the Great, a name that still echoes with reverence through English halls. But Wessex's greatness did not end with him. Rather, Alfred laid a foundation that his descendants would build upon with care, until the scattered shards of the Anglo-Saxon world were pieced together into something like a nation. After Alfred's passing in 899, his son Edward the Elder inherited the throne. A quiet, methodical man, Edward continued his father's policies. He understood, as Alfred had, that strength came not from conquest alone, but from structure and faith. He fortified towns, reorganized the army, and worked closely with the church. Perhaps most remarkably, Edward did not rule alone. At his side was his sister, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. Ethelflaed, widow of a Mercian lord, became a powerful and beloved leader in her own right. When her husband died, she assumed command of Mercia, a kingdom that had long been declining, and brought it back to life. She led armies, negotiated with Viking chieftains, and built fortified burhs across the Midlands. In her time, she became as respected as any king. And under her leadership, Mercia allied with Wessex in a partnership of blood and purpose. This alliance was not forced. It was familial, strategic, and bound by mutual respect. Together, Edward and Ethelflaed recaptured lands lost to the Danes, and slowly, piece by piece, brought the Danelaw back under English rule. Villages that had flown the Raven banner now flew the White Dragon of Wessex. Law and order, once fragmented, began to return. Edward's son, Ethelstan, would take this work even further. When Edward passed in 924, Ethelstan ascended the throne, not just of Wessex, but of all the English peoples. Æthelstan's coronation in 925 was a moment of true unity. He was crowned in a Christian ceremony of sacred symbolism, the first English king to be acknowledged across the entire realm. His rule marked the transition from regional kingship to a national monarchy. Under Æthelstan's guidance, the notion of a single English kingdom took form, not merely through maps or armies, but through law, learning, and diplomacy. He issued national law codes, the first of their kind. He strengthened ties with the church. He received gifts and emissaries from continental Europe. He was even praised by foreign kings as a king of kings, so high did his influence rise. But Æthelstan was not just a king of ceremony. He was a skilled military leader. In 937, he led a coalition of English forces to victory at the Battle of Brunanburh, defeating a combined army of Scots, Vikings, and Britons. This decisive battle, though shrouded in mystery as to its precise location, was remembered for generations as the moment when the unity of England was defended in blood. Poets celebrated it. Chroniclers recorded it. And through this great clash, the English monarchy was no longer a dream or a hope, but a reality. The rise of Wessex, then, is not simply a tale of expanding borders. It is a story of administrative genius, religious devotion, familial strength, and cultural resilience. It is the tale of a house that ruled wisely, preserved learning, and invited the church to stand close beside the throne. In the twilight of the 10th century, Æthelstan was succeeded by a line of kings who bore the weight of this newly united land: Edmund, Edred, Edgar the Peaceful, each of them shaping the English monarchy further. King Edgar, in particular, would be remembered for his grand coronation in 973, a ritual so rich in symbolism and solemnity that it forms the basis of the modern coronation ceremony used by British monarchs to this day. Crown were given, symbols not just of authority, but of service. Under Edgar's rule, England knew peace. Ships patrolled the coasts. Laws were enforced fairly. The church flourished. The idea of England as a single Christian kingdom, ruled by a king bound to both law and conscience, had finally taken shape. But peace, like all things, is fragile. After Edgar's death, succession Æthelflaed's courage, Æthelstan's unity, and Edgar's serenity would endure. That legacy, rooted in the fields and forts of Wessex, became the bedrock of the British monarchy. A monarchy that would evolve through centuries of change, but always carry with it the deep echo of those early kings and queens who shaped a nation from strife and hope. And so, as the candle of chapter 1 flickers to its end, we stand now at the threshold of England itself, united, anointed, and ready to face the chapters yet to come. The fall of Anglo-Saxon England. The morning mist still clung to the English fields in the year 1066 when fate came galloping over the Channel. The Anglo-Saxon world, which had endured invasion, reform, and unity, now stood on the brink of monumental change. This was the year of 3 kings, and one great conquest. At the start of 1066, Edward the Confessor, the pious king of England, passed away. He left no direct heir, and though he had been a man of devotion and calm, his death unleashed a storm. 3 men laid claim to the throne. First, Harold Godwin's son, the powerful Earl of Wessex, who was quickly crowned king. Second, Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, who believed he had a rightful claim through an old treaty. And third, William, Duke of Normandy, a distant relative of Edward's, who asserted that Edward had promised him the crown, and that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim. England soon found itself under siege from both north and south. Harold Godwin's son, acting swiftly, first marched north and met the forces of Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Viking threat was crushed, and Hardrada fell, never to see Norwegian rule over England. But even as Harold celebrated his victory, news came of a new invasion. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. With no time to rest, Harold led his weary troops south. There, at a place called Hastings, on the 14th of October, 1066, the 2 armies met. The Battle of Hastings was long and brutal. For hours, the fate of a kingdom hung in balance. The Anglo-Saxons formed a shield wall atop Senlac Hill, while the Normans, mounted and mobile, tried to break their line. As dusk approached, a fateful blow struck Harold, an arrow to the eye, as legend says, and with his fall, the Saxon line broke. William was victorious. Harold lay dead, and the age of the Anglo-Saxon kings was at an end. William the Conqueror and the Norman Transformation. With fire and ceremony, William, Duke of Normandy, became William I of England, known forever as William the Conqueror. His coronation took place on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey. The crowning of a foreign duke marked not only a change in ruler, but a seismic shift in England's entire social and political structure. The Normans brought with them a new language, a new nobility, and a new vision of kingship. William rewarded his loyal followers by distributing lands across England, displacing the old Anglo-Saxon lords. Castles, unknown before, began to rise, stone fortresses such as the Tower of London, designed not only for defense, but to remind the people of the new order. To understand and tax his realm efficiently, William commissioned a great survey, the Domesday Book, in 1086. This meticulous record listed every landholder, every village, every plough, ox, and mill across England. It was, in its time, the most thorough census in European history, and a symbol of royal control. Yet William was not merely a conqueror with a sword. He governed with a firm hand, yes, but also with a deep understanding of power. He kept the church under his authority, refused to be subservient to the Pope, and enforced strong central rule. His death in 1087 passed the crown to his son, William II, known as William Rufus. Though his reign was less celebrated, it continued the Norman legacy of strength, tension with the church, and the ongoing reshaping of English governance. The conquest had not merely replaced one king with another. It had redefined monarchy, embedding it within a feudal system that linked loyalty to land, and land to royal favor. The rise of Henry I and royal administration. After the mysterious death of William Rufus in 1100, the crown passed to his younger brother, Henry I. Known for his intelligence and administrative skill, Henry would continue the work of structuring the English monarchy with greater efficiency. He issued the Charter of Liberties, a forerunner to Magna Carta, promising to end corrupt practices and protect the church. He reformed the royal treasury, centralizing the collection of taxes and overseeing a more professional government. Henry married Matilda of Scotland, uniting Norman and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines. Their son, William, was expected to continue the dynasty. But in 1120, tragedy struck. The White Ship, carrying young William and other nobles across the Channel, sank. Nearly all aboard were lost. With his heir gone, Henry forced his barons to swear loyalty to his daughter, Empress Matilda. It was a bold and unprecedented step. No woman had yet ruled England in her own right. When Henry died in 1135, the stage was set for a bitter and prolonged civil war. The anarchy and the struggle for succession. The death of Henry I plunged the kingdom into chaos. Though Matilda had been named heir, her cousin Stephen of Blois, swift and ambitious, seized the crown. Thus began a period known as the Anarchy, a time of lawlessness, siege warfare, and bitter rivalry. Matilda, supported by loyal nobles and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, invaded England. For years, the conflict raged without clear resolution. Castles changed hands. Regions fell into disorder. The clergy and people suffered. In 1141, Matilda even managed to capture Stephen, declaring herself Lady of the English. But her failure to be crowned and rising opposition led to her retreat. The war dragged on. Eventually, through negotiation rather than battle, peace was brokered. Stephen would remain king for life, but Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, would succeed him. This agreement laid the foundation for a new and powerful dynasty, the Plantagenets. Henry II and the Angevin Empire. When Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, he inherited a fragmented realm, but his ambition reached far beyond England's borders. Through inheritance, marriage, and conquest, Henry controlled vast lands in France, including Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and more. His rule extended from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. This sprawling dominion became known as the Angevin Empire. Henry was a tireless reformer. He professionalized the legal system, creating royal courts and the use of jury trials, strengthening the idea that law flowed from the crown. His reforms laid the foundation of the English common law. Yet Henry's reign was marred by conflict, none more famous than his quarrel with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Once friends, they clashed over the rights of the church. In 1170, Becket was murdered by 4 knights, allegedly spurred by Henry's frustrated words. The outcry was immense. Henry performed penance, but the wound to his reputation lingered. In his later years, Henry's sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, turned against him. His final days were filled with betrayal and sorrow, and in 1189, he died heartbroken. Richard the Lionheart and the Age of Crusades. Strength and unwavering dedication to the Third Crusade. Though he spent little time in England, his legend grew abroad. He battled with Saladin, the great Muslim leader, in the Holy Land. Though he did not reclaim Jerusalem, Richard's courage earned him admiration. Captured on his return from crusade, he was held for ransom in Germany. The English people paid a heavy price for his release, but the story added to his mythos. Richard died in battle in France in 1199, and with his passing, the crown fell to his younger brother, John. King John and the Magna Carta. King John is remembered, often harshly, for his heavy taxation, military failures, and disputes with his barons. He lost key territories in France and clashed repeatedly with the church and nobility. By 1215, England was on the brink of rebellion. The barons rose up, forcing John to meet them at Runnymede, where he sealed the Magna Carta, a charter of liberties limiting royal power and asserting that the king was subject to the law. Though John soon broke his promises and reignited war, the Magna Carta endured. It would become a symbol of constitutional governance, invoked in later centuries as a cornerstone of English liberty. Henry III and the evolution of Parliament. John's son, Henry III, came to the throne as a child. His long reign saw continuing tension between crown and nobility. As he grew, so too did dissatisfaction with his governance and favoritism. This led to the rise of Simon de Montfort, who, in 1265, called a parliament that included not just nobles and clergy, but also commoners, an important step toward modern representative government. Though de Montfort was killed, the idea of parliament had taken root. Edward I and the Hammer of the Scots. Henry's son, Edward I, was a formidable king and administrator. He conquered Wales, building mighty castles and establishing English rule. He sought to bring Scotland under his control, but faced fierce resistance, especially from William Wallace and later Robert the Bruce. Edward was known for his legal reforms, creating statutes that shaped the English Commonwealth, and for calling regular parliaments, setting precedent for future monarchs. The waning of the Plantagenets. Edward's son, Edward II, proved a weak and divisive ruler. His reign was marked by favoritism, military defeat at Bannockburn, and internal strife. Eventually, he was deposed by his wife, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. Their son, Edward III, would reclaim royal power and begin a new chapter in English monarchy, one filled with chivalry, plague, and a 100-Year War. But that is a tale for the next chapter. The 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. The 100 Years' War begins. The seeds of conflict were sown, not in the soil of England itself, but in the distant lands of France. The year was 1337, and England's claim to the French throne was to ignite a war that would stretch across more than a century. The 100 Years' War, though marked by many battles, truces, and betrayals, was rooted in dynastic struggle, shifting alliances, and the fight for sovereignty. At the heart of the conflict lay a question: who had the right to rule France? The war continued after Joan's death, but both sides were weary. By 1453, after a series of defeats and internal strife, the English were forced to withdraw from most of their French territories. The Treaty of Pecquigny, 1471, formally ended hostilities between England and France, bringing the 100 Years' War to a close. England, though victorious in some battles, had ultimately failed in its quest to secure the French crown. The war left England financially drained, politically fractured, and deeply scarred. In many ways, it marked the end of an era of chivalric warfare and the beginning of more modern, state-centered conflicts. The Wars of the Roses begin. As England recovered from the long and costly war, the wounds of internal division festered. The ruling Plantagenet family, already weakened by years of warfare, faced a growing dispute between two rival factions, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. These two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty fought for control of the throne, setting the stage for the Wars of the Roses, a brutal, decades-long conflict that would tear the country apart. The conflict's name came from the symbolic emblems of the two factions, the red rose of the Lancasters and the white rose of the Yorkists. The war was not only about the throne, but about the power struggles, allegiances, and betrayals within the royal family itself. The first major battle of the Wars of the Roses was fought at St. Albans in 1455, and from there, the conflict escalated. The Lancastrian King Henry VI, who had inherited a fractured realm, was opposed by the Yorkist leader, Richard, Duke of York. The clash between these two factions would lead to numerous battles, sieges, and power struggles over the next few decades. The rise of Richard III and the fall of the Plantagenets. One of the most controversial and dramatic figures to emerge from the Wars of the Roses was Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England. Born as a member of the House of York, Richard ascended to the throne after the death of his brother, Edward IV, and the mysterious disappearance of his nephews, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, the so-called princes in the Tower. Richard's reign was marked by intrigue, suspicion, and the ever-present shadow of the York-Lancaster rivalry. His rise to power was seen by many as illegitimate, and his reign lasted only 2 years, from 1483 to 1485. In the summer of 1485, Richard met his end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where he was defeated by the forces of Henry Tudor, a Lancaster claimant. Richard's death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, as Henry VII ascended the throne, uniting the warring factions through marriage to Elizabeth of York, effectively ending the Wars of the Roses. The beginning of the Tudor dynasty. The ascent of Henry VII brought an end to the bloody struggle that had raged for so long. Henry, who had claimed the throne through his mother's bloodline, sought to consolidate his power and stabilize the kingdom. He married Elizabeth of York, bringing peace between the two warring houses and symbolizing the union of the red and white roses into one. Though his reign was marred by occasional challenges, both from Yorkist rivals and foreign threats, Henry's careful policies and shrewd alliances laid the foundation for a strong and prosperous monarchy. The Tudor dynasty would go on to rule England for over a century, beginning with Henry VII and continuing through his son, Henry VIII, and the reign of Elizabeth I. The impact of the wars on the English monarchy. The Wars of the Roses had lasting effects on the English monarchy. The devastating conflict drained resources, decimated noble families, and weakened the foundations of Plantagenet rule. The monarchy that emerged from this chaos was far more centralized, as kings sought to strengthen their control over their nobles and prevent further rebellion. The monarchy also became more powerful in terms of administration and military organization, with kings like Henry VII implementing reforms that strengthened royal authority. The wars had shown that the throne could be taken by force, but Henry VII's reign would show that the throne could also be stabilized through wise leadership and strategic marriage. The Tudor legacy and the Reformation. Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, would be the next great figure to shape the monarchy. His reign, marked by his split with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, would fundamentally alter the nature of English governance. Henry's desire for a male heir, his numerous marriages, and his conflicts with the Catholic Church set the stage for significant political and religious upheaval. The English Reformation would forever change the balance of power between the monarchy and the Church, paving the way for the eventual consolidation of royal power and the rise of absolute monarchy in England. The end of the wars and the rise of a new era. With the defeat of Richard III and the rise of Henry VII, the long, bloody era of the Wars of the Roses finally came to a close. The country, though weary and scarred by years of civil war, began to recover under the Tudor dynasty. The monarchy would continue to evolve, leading to the great Elizabethan age of cultural flourishing, exploration, and international influence. The Tudor dynasty and the English Reformation. The rise of Henry VII. In the fading light of the 15th century, with the smoke of Bosworth Field yet to drift into memory, there stood a man of cautious temperament and quiet resolve. He was Henry Tudor, the seventh of his name to wear the English crown. His claim was tenuous, his lineage winding like ivy through the tangled branches of Lancaster and Beaufort. Yet it was upon his brow that the crown now rested, and with careful steps, he set about securing a throne racked by decades of bloodshed. Henry VII knew the value of appearance as well as the weight of legitimacy. In the early days of his reign, he moved swiftly. He married Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of the late Edward IV, thereby binding together the two houses that had torn England apart. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were entwined, their petals blooming upon the same royal seal. Yet not all were content. Pretenders arose, figures like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be lost princes or scions of York. With quiet patience and relentless order, Henry quashed their rebellions. He created the Court of Star Chamber to deal with noble lawlessness, reigned in the great houses, and strengthened the royal treasury through bonds and fines. In coin, in council, and in courtly dignity, Henry restored the realm. He left to his son a kingdom orderly and prosperous, if not yet peaceful of heart. And so, in the year 1509, the careful reign of Henry VII came to an end, and the age of caution yielded to the age of grandeur. The youth and coronation of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was 17 years of age when he ascended the throne. Tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, with golden hair and a love of pageantry. The kingdom looked upon him as a vision of renewal, a golden prince born to heal and glorify. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, forging an alliance of deep political import. Together, they were crowned in Westminster Abbey, and the people cheered as if a new Arthur had risen. At first, Henry delighted in tournaments, music, and diplomacy. He was a scholar and a sportsman, a composer of songs and a wielder of swords. His court sparkled with color and grace. But beneath the satin and steel, ambition stirred. He longed for glory on the battlefield and sought to recover England's honor on the continent. Yet wars proved costly, and alliances ever-shifting. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey rose to become his chief advisor, wielding vast power and negotiating treaties. Still, the great matter of Henry's heart would soon come to define his reign, not in the courts of Europe, but in the shadow of his own throne. The king's great matter. As years passed and Catherine bore him no surviving sons, Henry's anxiety grew. One daughter, Mary, lived, but a male heir eluded him. In his mind, this was a curse, a divine judgment, perhaps for having wed his brother's widow. He fell in love with Anne Boleyn, a lady of wit and sharpness, whose refusal to become his mistress only deepened his obsession. To marry her, he would need his union with Catherine annulled. Thus began the king's great matter. Henry petitioned the Pope for an annulment, claiming his marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. But Catherine refused to go quietly, and her nephew, the powerful Emperor Charles V, pressed the Pope not to comply. Wolsey failed to secure the annulment and fell from grace, his power broken like glass on stone. Thus, Henry turned inward, toward the scholars and preachers who spoke of sovereignty, scripture, and divine kingship. And slowly, the idea took root. If Rome would not grant the annulment, then England must no longer bow to Rome. The English Reformation begins. In the year 1533, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void and his union with Anne Boleyn valid. In return, Henry acknowledged himself as supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with the Pope. This moment, both thunderous and silent, marked the beginning of the English Reformation. Monasteries that had stood for centuries were scrutinized, and soon, their riches were seized. The dissolution of the monasteries followed, led by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new chief minister. Ancient abbeys were dismantled, their lands sold to nobles loyal to the crown. The rhythm of prayer that once marked the countryside fell into hush, and the fabric of English religious life was forever altered. Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. But she, too, failed to produce a male heir. Her fall was swift, and she was executed in 1536, accused of adultery and treason. The wheel turned. The marriages of Henry VIII. Henry would marry 4 more times. Jane Seymour, his third wife, gave him a son, Edward, but died soon after childbirth. Anne of Cleves, his fourth, was divorced after a brief and awkward union. Catherine Howard, his fifth, was young and lively but fell to charges of infidelity and was beheaded. His final wife, Catherine Parr, outlived him. She was learned and pious, and she helped reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Together, they formed a portrait of a royal family fragmented and restored, wounded and enduring. Henry VIII died in 1547, corpulent and troubled. His reign had reshaped England, its church, its lands, its very soul. Though his search for sons defined him, it was his daughters who would reign longest and most profoundly. The short reign of Edward VI. Edward VI, son of Jane Seymour, ascended the throne at the age of 9. Pale and frail, he was a boy of precocious intelligence and sincere Protestant faith. Under the regency of his uncles, the Seymours, and later the Duke of Northumberland, the Church of England moved further from Rome. The Mass was abolished, altars were removed, and the Book of Common Prayer was introduced. England became visibly Protestant, even as its people, especially in the north and west, clung to older forms. Edward's reign lasted but 6 years. As illness overtook him, a plot was formed to preserve Protestant rule. His cousin, Lady Jane Grey, was named his successor, a gentle and reluctant pawn in a dangerous game. Mary I and the return to Rome. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was not so easily cast aside. With popular support, she marched upon London and claimed the throne. Lady Jane Grey was deposed after 9 days and later executed. Mary, a devout Catholic, set about restoring the old faith. Churches were refitted, priests reordained, and England was once more under papal authority. Yet her efforts were marred by persecution. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake during her reign, earning her the moniker Bloody Mary in later generations. She married Philip II of Spain, a union unpopular with the people. Her hopes of bearing a child faded into phantom pregnancies, and her final years were marked by disappointment and isolation. Mary died in 1558, and with her death, the Catholic revival ended. A new dawn was rising, brighter, longer, and profoundly English. The accession of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, took the throne in a kingdom weary of war and confusion. Tall, red-haired, and fiercely intelligent, she ascended with caution and grace. Her legitimacy was questioned by Rome, but her will was iron. She re-established the Church of England, balancing Protestant doctrine with ceremonial splendor. The Elizabethan religious settlement created a broad, national church, neither fully Catholic nor radically reformed. In this, she kept the peace. Elizabeth never married, claiming she was wed to her people. She surrounded herself with loyal advisors, William Cecil, Robert Dudley, and later Francis Walsingham, and she ruled as both queen and symbol, a figure of majesty and myth. The Spanish Armada and the Golden Age. In 1588, Philip II of Spain launched the Spanish Armada, seeking to restore Catholicism by conquest. But the winds favored England. The English navy, though smaller, was nimble and daring. Fireships scattered the great fleet, and storms battered it into retreat. The victory was hailed as divine favor. Elizabeth stood before her troops at Tilbury, clad in armor, declaring that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. Her reign blossomed into what many call the English Golden Age. Literature flourished. Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser penned immortal lines. Exploration expanded. Drake, Raleigh, and Hawkins sailed to distant shores. England stood proud and unified, if not always peaceful. The end of the Tudor line. As the 16th century drew to a close, Elizabeth aged without heir. She remained steadfast, solitary, and shrouded in legend. Courtiers flattered her, poets praised her, and the common folk revered her as Gloriana. But time waits for no monarch. In 1603, the Queen passed from this world, ending the Tudor dynasty. Yet she left behind a legacy of resilience, intellect, and nationhood. The English identity had been forged in her reign. Its church, its language, and its destiny. With her death, the crown passed to her cousin's son, James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one head. The Stuarts and the English Civil War. The union of the crowns, James VI and I. In the spring of 1603, after the long twilight of Queen Elizabeth's reign, the English crown passed peacefully into the hands of her distant cousin, James Stuart, King of Scotland. He was the son of the ill-fated Mary, Queen of Scots, and had ruled the northern kingdom since infancy. Now, he became James VI of Scotland and James I of England, two crowns united upon one royal brow. The union of the crowns was not the union of the kingdoms. England and Scotland would remain legally separate, each with its own parliament. But the journey toward eventual unification had begun. James arrived in London with hopes of peace, stability, and divine right. He believed in monarchy as a sacred institution, bestowed by God and answerable to no man. He styled himself as a peacemaker, a scholar king, and a father to the nation. Yet tensions stirred beneath the surface. His court was criticized for its extravagance and favoritism, particularly toward young male courtiers. Parliament bristled under his lectures on kingship. And among the people, religious uncertainty brewed. James commissioned a new English Bible, the King James Version, completed in 1611, a work of prose and poetry that would echo through the centuries. But his attempts to placate both Catholics and Protestants failed, and in 1605, a shadow crept into the cellars beneath Parliament. The Gunpowder Plot. The 5th of November, 1605, dawned quietly, but what it uncovered would echo in memory for generations. A group of Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and joined by Guy Fawkes, had plotted to blow up the Houses of Parliament during its opening session. Their plan was born from frustration. James had not delivered the tolerance they had hoped for. Instead, Catholics remained marginalized, fined, and watched. In the dead of night, barrels of gunpowder were discovered hidden beneath the House of Lords. Guy Fawkes was found standing guard, ready to ignite the fuse. He was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed, along with his fellow plotters. The failed plot led to a harsh crackdown on Catholics, but it also embedded a deep association between monarchy, Protestantism, and national identity. Remember the 5th of November. The rhyme went, and England remembered, with bonfires and effigies. James ruled until 1625, his reign mostly peaceful, his legacy mixed. But he left behind a son far less diplomatic and far more stubborn. Charles I and the divine right of kings. Charles I was solemn, reserved, and deeply committed to the idea that kings were God's appointed stewards on earth. His belief in divine right was unshakable. Unlike his father, he disliked compromise, and his dealings with Parliament were fraught from the outset. From the beginning of his reign, Charles clashed with the Commons over taxation, war, and religious policy. He married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, which raised fears among the Protestant populace. When Parliament resisted his financial demands, Charles dissolved it, multiple times. In 1629, he embarked upon the personal rule, governing without Parliament for 11 years. He imposed taxes like ship money without parliamentary consent, and his attempts to enforce religious uniformity, especially in Scotland, led to widespread unrest. The king's policies stirred discontent among Puritans, Scots, and English gentry alike. The tension was thickening. Storm clouds were gathering. The road to civil war. In 1640, forced by rebellion in Scotland and the need for funds, Charles recalled Parliament. This Parliament, known as the Long Parliament, quickly moved to limit royal authority. They passed measures to curtail the king's ability to dissolve Parliament, and they prosecuted Charles's advisers. The king's response was indecisive, but his anger simmered. In 1642, after failed negotiations and a botched attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament, Charles fled London and raised his standard at Nottingham. Civil war had come, brother against brother, father against son. The war was not fought for territory, but for principle. It was a struggle over who should rule, and by what authority. The very soul of the kingdom was at stake. Royalists, supporters of the king, were called Cavaliers. Parliamentarians, His opponents were known as Roundheads. And England braced for war. The English Civil War, first phase. The war began in earnest in 1642. Early battles were inconclusive, with both sides claiming minor victories. The king's forces were strong in the north and west. Parliament controlled London and the southeast. Parliament reorganized under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, a country squire turned military commander. He formed the new model army, disciplined, professional, and guided by Puritan zeal. In 1645, the Battle of Naseby proved decisive. The Royalists were routed, and Charles's fate darkened. He surrendered not to Parliament, but to the Scots, hoping for leniency. The Scots handed him over, and the king was imprisoned. Yet peace was elusive. Even in captivity, Charles plotted, negotiated, and maneuvered. A second civil war broke out in 1648, but Parliament triumphed again. This time, the victors chose a path never before taken: the trial and execution of a king. In a cold January of 1649, Charles I was put on trial for high treason, an unthinkable act. Kings were above the law, not subject to it. Yet here he stood, calm, dignified, and unyielding. He refused to recognize the court's authority, declaring that a subject could not judge his sovereign. But the verdict was already written. On January 30th, 1649, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, Charles was led to a scaffold. He wore 2 shirts to prevent shivering in the cold, lest it be mistaken for fear. He knelt. He prayed. And with one swift stroke, his head was severed from his body. The crowd groaned, not in triumph, but in awe and sorrow. The monarchy had been overthrown. A republic, the Commonwealth, was declared. England stood at a crossroads, without a king for the first time in 1,000 years. The interregnum and Oliver Cromwell. Following the king's execution in 1642, after failed negotiations and a botched attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament, Charles fled London and raised his standard at Nottingham. Civil war had come, brother against brother, father against son. The war was not fought for territory, but for principle. It was a struggle over who should rule, and by what authority. The very soul of the kingdom was at stake. Royalists, supporters of the king, were called Cavaliers. Parliamentarians, his opponents, were known as Roundheads. And England braced for war. The English Civil War, first phase. The war began in earnest in 1642. Early battles were inconclusive, with both sides claiming minor victories. The king's forces were strong in the north and west. Parliament controlled London and the southeast. Parliament reorganized under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, a country squire turned military commander. He formed the new model army, disciplined, professional, and guided by Puritan zeal. In 1645, the Battle of Naseby proved decisive. The Royalists were routed, and Charles's fate darkened. He surrendered not to Parliament, but to the Scots, hoping for leniency. The Scots handed him over, and the king was imprisoned. Yet peace was elusive. Even in captivity, Charles plotted, negotiated, and maneuvered. A second civil war broke out in 1648, but Parliament triumphed again. This time, the victors chose a path never before taken: the trial and execution of a king. In a cold January of 1649, Charles I was put on trial for high treason, an unthinkable act. Kings were above the law, not subject to it. Yet here he stood, calm, dignified, and unyielding. He refused to recognize the court's authority, declaring that a subject could not judge his sovereign. But the verdict was already written. On January 30th, 1649, outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, Charles was led to a scaffold. He wore 2 shirts to prevent shivering in the cold, lest it be mistaken for fear. He knelt. He prayed. And with one swift stroke, his head was severed from his body. The crowd groaned, not in triumph, but in awe and sorrow. The monarchy had been overthrown. A republic, the Commonwealth, was declared. England stood at a crossroads, without a king for the first time in 1,000 years. The interregnum and Oliver Cromwell. Following the king's execution, England became a republic. The House of Lords was abolished. The monarchy was declared useless and dangerous. Power rested with the Rump Parliament, and soon, with Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell dismissed the Rump in 1653 and became Lord Protector, a title more military than regal. He ruled with Puritan severity, banning theatre, dancing, and even Christmas celebrations. His government brought some stability and reformed laws, but it was marked by military rule and harsh treatment of dissent, especially in Ireland. He died in 1658, and his son Richard briefly succeeded him, but lacked his father's authority. The experiment with republicanism had run its course. The people yearned for order, and for something ancient and familiar. The restoration of Charles II. In 1660, Parliament invited Charles II, son of the executed king, to return from exile. The monarchy was restored with joy and relief. Church bells rang. Bonfires lit the sky. Charles II returned not as a conqueror, but as a reconciler. He promised amnesty and tolerance, though not all would be spared. The regicides, those who signed his father's death warrant, were hunted down and punished. Charles was witty, charming, and fond of pleasure. His court was lively, his mistresses many, and his policies pragmatic. He navigated the religious and political tensions of the day with careful skill. Though officially Anglican, Charles tolerated Catholics privately and flirted with French alliances. He ruled through Parliament, though tensions remained. His reign witnessed the Great Plague, 1665, the Great Fire of London, 1666, and the construction of St. Paul's Cathedral, rising from the ashes. The reign of James II and the Glorious Revolution. When Charles II died in 1685, his brother James II ascended the throne. James was openly Catholic, and his efforts to promote religious tolerance for Catholics alarmed the Protestant establishment. He dismissed judges, packed Parliament, and issued declarations of indulgence. He placed Catholics in command of the army. The birth of a Catholic son in 1688 raised fears of a Catholic dynasty. 7 English nobles invited William of Orange, husband to James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade. William landed with an army. James, deserted by his supporters, fled. In what became known as the Glorious Revolution, Parliament declared that James had abdicated. William and Mary were offered the crown jointly, under conditions that ensured parliamentary supremacy. No blood was shed in this transfer of power, thus glorious in name and in memory. The Bill of Rights and Constitutional Monarchy. In 1689, the new monarchs accepted the Bill of Rights, a document that forever altered the monarchy's role. It prohibited the king from suspending laws, levying taxes without consent, or maintaining a standing army in peacetime. It affirmed Parliament's right to regular meetings and free elections. It enshrined trial by jury and freedom from cruel punishment. Above all, it made clear, the monarch ruled with Parliament's consent. This was the birth of constitutional monarchy in Britain, a system where the sovereign reigned, but did not govern. The age of divine right had ended. A new balance had been struck. London became a city of salons, assemblies, and pleasure gardens. The architecture of John Nash reshaped the West End. Jane Austen penned quiet revolutions in drawing rooms and parishes. But beneath the surface, the country bore scars. The Napoleonic Wars drained resources and took thousands of lives. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the landscape. Cities blackened with coal, children labored in mills, and the old rhythms of rural life dissolved. The monarchy, though still central, became more symbolic. Real power lay increasingly in Parliament, with figures such as William Pitt and Lord Liverpool steering the ship of state. When George III died in 1820, the regency officially ended. The prince became King George IV, but his rule was short and burdened by ill health and unpopularity. George IV and William IV. George IV, though cultured and refined in taste, was widely seen as extravagant and selfish. His building projects, such as the Brighton Pavilion, were ornate and exotic, but his debts were legendary. He quarreled with his wife, Caroline of Brunswick, and barred her from his coronation. The public sided with her, and his popularity waned. He died in 1830, and his brother, William IV, succeeded him. William was an unassuming man, formerly a naval officer, known as the Sailor King. His reign saw important reforms. The Reform Act of 1832 extended the franchise and eliminated rotten boroughs, making the electoral system more representative. Slavery was abolished in most of the British Empire in 1833. William was reluctant to intervene in politics, and his reign marked a further shift toward a constitutional monarchy governed by elected officials. He died in 1837, and with him ended the direct male line of the Hanoverians. The crown passed to a young niece, barely 18 years old. The rise of Victorian Britain. The transition to a ceremonial monarchy. By the close of William IV's reign, the nature of monarchy had changed profoundly from the days of the Tudors and Stuarts. No longer did kings or queens rule by divine right with unchecked authority. Instead, they reigned with dignity and restraint, guided by ministers and governed by laws passed in Parliament. The evolution had been gradual but significant. From George I's disinterest in English affairs to George III's determined involvement, and finally to William IV's contented detachment, each monarch had played a role in shaping the new role of the sovereign. The principle of constitutional monarchy was now firmly established. The king or queen no longer made policy but served as a living symbol of the state, a figure above politics, embodying continuity, tradition, and national identity. It was in this refined role that the crown awaited its next bearer. The British monarchy, still splendid in ceremony, had become more reserved in practice. It had survived the tempests of rebellion, war, and industrial change, and was ready to face a new century. But its next chapter would be written not by a seasoned statesman or battle-hardened prince, but by a young woman, barely out of childhood, named Victoria. Legacy of the Hanoverians. As the Hanoverian chapter gently draws to a close, we may look back over a dynasty that, though often understated, profoundly shaped the modern British monarchy. George I brought stability in uncertain times, respecting the supremacy of Parliament. George II led Britain through war and the beginnings of empire. George III, through illness and adversity, became a figure of national resilience. The Regency era brought cultural flourish and social transformation. George IV and William IV reigned in a time of transition, witnessing the final erosion of royal power and the rise of the People's Parliament. Under the Hanoverians, Britain expanded its global reach, reformed its domestic institutions, and embraced the Industrial Revolution. The seeds of modern democracy were planted, and the crown adjusted to its evolving role with grace and necessity. When William IV died in 1837, the crown passed smoothly to his niece, Victoria. And so ended the Hanoverian line, at least in name. For though Victoria was of Hanoverian blood, her descendants would bear a different house name, shaped by marriage and the tides of Europe. The Victorian era and the Age of Empire. The accession of Queen Victoria. It was in the quiet hours of the early morning, on the 20th of June, 1837, that the young Princess Victoria was awoken at Kensington Palace with news that would alter the course of her life and the destiny of a nation. Her uncle, King William IV, had passed away in the night. At just 18 years of age, Victoria became Queen of the United Kingdom. The new monarch was small in stature, softly spoken, and deeply conscientious. She was guided at first by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her trusted advisor Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister. These early years were formative. The young queen grew in confidence and understanding, learning the rhythms of court life and the ceremonial weight of her crown. Her coronation took place at Westminster Abbey in June 1838, a grand but solemn affair. Though she was still learning to rule, the people responded to her with affection and curiosity. Here was a queen for a new generation, untarnished by scandal or extravagance, embodying dignity, decorum, and a deep sense of duty. Britain itself was changing, growing in population, expanding in power, and entering fully into the age of industry and empire. The Victorian era had begun, though few yet knew just how long or profound it would become. The marriage of Victoria and Albert. In 1840, Queen Victoria married her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The match had been encouraged by family, but it soon grew into a deep and enduring love. Victoria adored Albert, not merely for his refinement and seriousness, but for his calm intelligence and moral compass. Albert, though a prince by title, had no official power. Yet he became the Queen's closest confidant and most trusted advisor. He took interest in matters of education, science, and public reform. In time, he would leave a lasting legacy not only on the monarchy, but on British society as a whole. Together, Victoria and Albert had 9 children. Their domestic life was idealized, held up as a model of virtue and stability. Family life became central to the monarchy's public image. Where earlier kings had ruled with might and sword, Victoria ruled with hearth and heart. Their bond was strong, their partnership sincere. They walked together through the ceremonial corridors of court and the quieter paths of country estates. For 21 years, they reigned side by side, not as equals in law, but as partners in spirit. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria's world darkened. The shadow of grief would remain for the rest of her days. The Great Exhibition and Industrial Triumph. It was Prince Albert who conceived the Great Exhibition of 1851, a vast display of human ingenuity, art, science, and progress. Held in the Crystal Palace, a marvel of glass and iron erected in Hyde Park, the event was a triumph of Victorian ambition and industry. More than 6 million visitors came to view the wonders of the age, steam engines, looms, microscopes, and marvels from across the globe. It was a celebration not just of Britain's achievements, but of human advancement in its many forms. The Queen opened the exhibition with solemn pride, and Albert stood by, beaming with quiet satisfaction. Here was the embodiment of the Victorian spirit, orderly, industrious, and confident in the promise of progress. The Great Exhibition also symbolized Britain's place at the center of a growing empire. Goods, ideas, and people flowed to and from its many colonies. London was not only a capital, it was the beating heart of a global network of trade, governance, and culture. Yet beneath the surface, not all shared in this prosperity. As factories flourished, so too did slums. Child labor, long hours, and urban squalor coexisted with elegance and invention. The age was brilliant, but not always kind. Reform and the expanding electorate. The Victorian era saw a gradual, careful widening of democracy. The Reform Act of 1832 had extended the vote to many middle-class men, but it was only the beginning. Throughout Victoria's reign, further reforms would slowly, methodically, broaden participation in government. The Reform Act of 1867 extended the franchise to many urban working men. Later acts in the 1880s and 1890s would do the same for rural laborious. Still, women remained excluded from voting, though voices for change were beginning to rise. Parliament became increasingly active. Figures such as Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone dominated public life, one a romantic conservative, the other a stern liberal. Their debates shaped policy and public opinion. The Queen, though formally above politics, often found herself drawn to these men, favoring Disraeli for his flattery and charm, distrusting Gladstone for his earnest intensity. Even as political power shifted outward, the monarchy retained its influence through moral authority and public affection. Victoria, though she no longer ruled directly, remained a powerful symbol of continuity, of propriety, and of national identity. The death of Prince Albert and the Queen's mourning. In December 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was just 42. The cause was typhoid fever, though some suggest that stress and overwork hastened his end. Victoria was devastated. She withdrew from public life, shunning court ceremonies and wearing black for the remainder of her reign. Her grief was profound and unrelenting. To her, Albert had been not just a husband, but a guide, a compass, a companion of the soul. The Queen retreated to her residences at Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Her absence from public affairs caused concern. Some whispered of abdication. Republican sentiment stirred in the press. But slowly, gradually, she re-emerged, still in mourning, but present once more. Her bond with her Scottish servant John Brown drew attention and speculation. Their relationship remains a subject of education expanded. New schools and universities welcomed the children of the middle and working classes. Literacy rates rose. Newspapers flourished. The printed word became a powerful force in shaping opinion and taste. Railways connected cities and towns. Telegraph cables crossed oceans. Electricity began to light homes. Scientific discoveries abounded, from Darwin's theories to advances in medicine. The Victorians had a boundless faith in progress. Social reform was slow but steady. Laws limited child labor, improved sanitation, and regulated housing. Philanthropy became fashionable. Workhouses, though harsh, were softened by legislation. Slowly, society bent toward compassion, even as it clung to discipline. Victorian morality prized modesty, hard work, and restraint. Yet beneath this rigid exterior, artists and writers explored darker truths. Dickens, the Brontes, and Thomas Hardy probed the struggles of ordinary people. Tennyson and Browning gave voice to longing and loss. The Pre-Raphaelites painted beauty tinged with sorrow. Through it all, Queen Victoria stood as a constant presence, remote yet familiar, reserved yet revered. Her reign gave the era its name. Her values shaped its spirit. The Queen's final years. In the twilight of the 19th century, Queen Victoria's health began to decline. Her walks grew shorter, her correspondence fewer. Still, she maintained her duties with quiet resolve. She was now the longest reigning monarch in British history, having surpassed George III. Her family extended across the royal houses of Europe. Her children and grandchildren married into the courts of Germany, Russia, Norway, Spain, and beyond. She had lived through immense change. When she came to the throne, horses pulled carriages through muddy streets. Now, automobiles rattled past electric lamps. She had witnessed the rise of photography, of moving pictures, of the telephone. The world she now inhabited was far from the one of her youth. Victoria found comfort in routine, in her dogs, in her highland retreats, in the familiar faces of her servants. She continued to read government papers, to meet with ministers, and to observe the empire she symbolized. In January of 1901, at the age of 81, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Her family gathered around her. She was laid to rest beside Prince Albert, her beloved consort, in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore. The news spread slowly, solemnly, across the world. Bells tolled in India. Flags lowered in Canada and Australia. People wept in the streets of London. Her reign had lasted over 63 years, the longest in British history at that time. An age had ended. Reflections on the Victorian Age. To reflect on the Victorian era is to look upon a time of extraordinary transformation. It was an age of paradox, of immense wealth and grinding poverty, of rigid morals and quiet rebellion, of peace and empire, invention and introspection. Queen Victoria herself embodied many of these contrasts. She was stern yet sentimental, regal yet domesticated, isolated yet adored. Her image was found on coins, portraits, and statues the world over. Her mourning veil became a symbol of constancy. Her name was synonymous with duty and restraint. Under her reign, Britain expanded its global reach, reformed its political institutions, and revolutionized its society. Industry thrived. Science advanced. Literature blossomed. And through it all, the monarchy endured, changed, softened, and stabilized. When Victoria died, it was not only a queen who passed, but a whole way of life. The 20th century loomed ahead, with its wars, technologies, and shifts in power. Yet the memory of the Victorian age lingered, sepia-toned and solemn, orderly and vast. The winds of change, from Edward to Elizabeth. The accession of Edward VII. With the passing of Queen Victoria in January of 1901, the crown passed to her eldest son, Albert Edward, who had waited nearly 60 years to become king. He took the name Edward VII, ushering in a brief but notable chapter known as the Edwardian era. Edward was 59 years old at the time of his accession, silver-haired, broad in frame, and jovial in demeanor. Unlike his mother, who was private and reserved, Edward was sociable and cosmopolitan. He had long moved in circles of diplomacy and high society, and he now brought a sense of openness and modernity to the throne. His coronation, delayed by illness, finally took place in August of 1902. It was a grand affair, marked by the pageantry that had become customary, but with the added brightness of a new century. Though his reign would last only 9 years, Edward VII played a crucial role in restoring the popularity of the monarchy. He traveled widely, cultivated good relations with foreign powers, and projected an image of regal confidence without the austere reserve of his mother. In these early years of the 20th century, Britain stood at the height of its imperial power, but change was stirring beneath the surface. The Edwardine era and its elegance. The Edwardine era, though short, has come to be remembered as a time of grace and elegance, a kind of golden afternoon before the storms of the modern age. It spanned from 1901 to 1910, and in its calm lies a kind of nostalgia. It was an age of grand country houses, of garden parties and new fashions. The upper classes lived in comfort, tended by armies of servants. Edward himself set the tone. Fond of fine food, cigars, racing, and the theatre, he was a king of culture and refinement. Yet, alongside this splendor, the age also saw the stirrings of social unrest. The working classes were beginning to demand more rights, and the gap between rich and poor was more visible than ever. Women, too, were beginning to raise their voices, not only in drawing rooms, but in the streets. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum, and demonstrations for women's right to vote became louder and more organized. Still, the monarchy remained secure. Edward, with his charm and good humor, soothed tensions and projected stability. Foreign dignitaries admired him. The people, on the whole, accepted him. But time, ever flowing, carried Britain forward. Diplomacy and the Entente cordial. Edward VII, sometimes called the peacemaker, was deeply involved in foreign diplomacy. Fluent in French and familiar with the courts of Europe, he played a key role in fostering goodwill between nations, particularly between Britain and France. In 1904, the Entente cordial was signed, marking an end to centuries of intermittent hostility between the two nations. Though largely symbolic, the agreement laid the groundwork for future military alliances. Edward's state visits across Europe helped smooth tensions and strengthen ties. His familiarity with European royalty, many of whom were his relatives, allowed him to move easily among emperors and kings. However, not all was peaceful beneath the surface. Alliances were shifting, arms were building, and the great powers of Europe were watching one another with growing suspicion. Though the king promoted amity and dialogue, the world was moving inexorably toward conflict. Edward would not live to see the full unraveling, but the seeds of the First World War were already in the soil. The death of Edward VII and the accession of George V. On the 6th of May, 1910, Edward VII died after a series of heart attacks. He was mourned widely, his funeral attended by an extraordinary gathering of monarchs, presidents, and statesmen. The era of elegance was ending. His son, George, succeeded him as George V. Unlike his father, George was reserved, disciplined, and dutiful, more in the mold of Queen Victoria than Edward VII. George had not expected to be king. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, had died young, and George had taken his place in the line of succession. His background in the Navy had shaped his character, quiet, conservative, and dedicated to duty. In a time of growing unrest, George V provided a steady hand. His coronation in 1911 reaffirmed the rituals of monarchy, even as the world outside grew more restless. Now, the kingdom stood on the edge of a precipice. The years ahead would test both monarch and nation in ways not yet imagined. The First World War and the royal family. In 1914, the world plunged into war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a chain of alliances and hostilities, and soon Europe was engulfed in a conflict unlike any before. Britain entered the war in August 1914. George V stood with his people, visiting troops, inspecting ships, and boosting morale. Though largely symbolic, his presence mattered. He was seen as a father figure, a symbol of unity in a time of chaos. The war had a personal dimension for George. He was a cousin of both Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. But familial ties could not prevent the devastation that unfolded. Amid rising anti-German sentiment, George made a significant decision. In 1917, he changed the royal house's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, a name more English, more stable, and free of foreign associations. This simple act helped preserve the monarchy in a time of suspicion and strife. The House of Windsor was born, and the royal family emerged more British in identity, if not in origin. The war ended in 1918, but the world it left behind was changed forever. Post-war adjustments and political change. The aftermath of the First World War brought hardship and reflection. Britain had won, but at a terrible cost. Millions dead, cities changed, empires shaken. George V presided over a country grappling with grief, debt, and transition. The political map was changing. In 1922, the Irish Free State was established, reducing British rule to Northern Ireland. The empire, though still vast, was beginning to shift toward a commonwealth. Domestically, the Labour Party was rising, representing the voice of the working class. In 1924, Britain saw its first Labour Prime Minister. The monarchy, long tied to tradition, now found itself navigating a new and more democratic landscape. George adapted quietly. He met with ministers, offered counsel, and remained above party politics. He was not flamboyant, but he was respected. His restraint became a virtue. In times of unrest, during strikes, protests, and the Depression, his calm presence offered reassurance. The Silver Jubilee and the King's declining health. In 1935, George V marked his Silver Jubilee, celebrating 25 years on the throne. It was a time of reflection and modest celebration, as the country, still wearied by war and depression, looked to its monarch for steadiness. The king had grown visibly older. Years of diligent service had taken their toll. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, made worse by decades of smoking. Yet he endured his duties with grace, appearing on balconies, attending services, and offering words of quiet gratitude to his people. The Jubilee was met with widespread affection. In an era increasingly dominated by mass media, it was one of the first royal events to be broadcast by radio, bringing the king's voice into homes across Britain and the empire. His message was one of humility and national unity. Despite his declining health, George remained diligent. He read state papers, received ministers, and kept a steady eye on the affairs of his realm. But by early 1936, his health faltered beyond recovery. On the 20th of January, he passed away at Sandringham. His last words were quiet, like the rain he had stewarded. The bells tolled once more for a departed sovereign. The crown would now pass to his eldest son, handsome, charismatic, and soon controversial. The abdication crisis of Edward VIII. When Edward VIII came to the throne in 1936, there was much anticipation. He was modern, stylish, and immensely popular. He had served during the war and had traveled widely. To many, he represented a new kind of monarch for a changing age. But almost immediately, controversy followed. Edward had formed a romantic attachment to Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. When he announced his intention to marry her, a constitutional crisis erupted. The Church of England, of which Edward was the head, did not permit remarriage after divorce. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, informed the king that the marriage would be unacceptable to the British public and incompatible with his position. Edward faced a choice: the crown or the woman he loved. In December 1936, after less than a year on the throne, Edward abdicated. He signed the instrument of abdication and stepped aside, becoming the Duke of Windsor. In a radio broadcast, he famously declared, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." It was a moment of profound shock for the monarchy. Never before had a king voluntarily renounced the throne. His younger brother, Albert, now became king, taking the name George VI. He was shy, afflicted with a stammer, and unprepared, but determined to do his duty. Thus, Britain had two kings in 1 year, an echo of instability rarely seen in modern times. George VI, war, and the spirit of resistance. George VI ascended the throne in December 1936, reluctantly but resolutely. His coronation in 1937 was marked by subdued pageantry, shadowed by the recent abdication. Yet the people quickly took to him, admiring his sincerity and quiet courage. He was a family man, devoted to his wife Elizabeth and their daughters, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. With his calm and honest demeanor, he slowly rebuilt trust in the monarchy. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, George VI became a symbol of national unity. He and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London during the Blitz, even after Buckingham Palace was bombed. They visited bombed neighborhoods, hospitals, and military units, walking among the people, sharing in their hardship. He delivered wartime radio addresses, his voice halting but heartfelt. His Christmas broadcasts became beacons of comfort, reaching across the airwaves to soldiers, evacuees, and citizens alike. The royal family's decision to stay in Britain, rather than flee to safety, endeared them deeply to the nation. The king's loyalty mirrored the people's own. Victory in 1945 brought jubilation, but also exhaustion. Britain emerged victorious, but diminished, its empire fraying, its economy strained. Still, the crown had held. George VI had proven that a monarch, even one thrust into power unwillingly, could guide a nation through its darkest hour. The dawn of a new reign, Elizabeth II. The post-war years were challenging. Rationing lingered. The empire continued to dissolve. India had gained independence in 1947, and other colonies were preparing to follow. George VI's health began to decline in the early 1950s. He had undergone surgery for lung cancer, and his strength was fading. In early 1952, he bade farewell to his daughter Elizabeth as she departed for a royal tour of the Commonwealth. It would be the last time they would meet. On the 6th of February, 1952, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. Princess Elizabeth, just 25 years old, became queen. The news reached her while she was in Kenya. She returned at once, stepping off the plane in black, already carrying the weight of the crown. So began the reign of Elizabeth II, a young woman thrust into a role of immense responsibility in a world still recovering from war, and entering an age of rapid change. Her coronation in 1953 was a landmark moment, watched by millions on television, the first such event to be broadcast in full. It marked the beginning not only of a new reign, but of a new era of monarchy, one of visibility, diplomacy, and enduring service. Through centuries of conquest and counsel, splendor and sorrow, the British monarchy has stood as a quiet witness to the tides of history. From the early kings who ruled with sword and scepter, to the queens who reigned with grace and resolve, the story of the crown has never been a tale of stillness. It has risen and faltered, transformed and endured, woven tightly into the fabric of the nation. In Queen Elizabeth II, the monarchy found its most enduring symbol, unwavering, serene, and ever-present. Through wars and jubilees, through family trials and national triumphs, she remained a steady light, casting calm across changing skies. The modern monarchy, no longer absolute in power, continues as a living link to the past, a symbol not of rule, but of continuity. It does not command armies nor draft laws, but it holds something deeper: memory, tradition, and unity. As the crown now passes into the reign of a new sovereign, its weight is not just gold and gem, but centuries of legacy and service. And so, the story does not end. It continues, softly, gently, just as it always has. Through silence, ceremony, and the slow passage of time, the crown endures.